Welcome all of the poets and all of the watchers to our second poetry reading event. We're really excited, and I am super grateful to be part of, of this reading with accomplished and skilled poets. I am Srishti Prabha. I'm the assistant editor at India Currents, and I want to thank you all for coming, but I also want to tell you a little bit about this event. So India Currents is putting on this event in collaboration with Matwaala. And in case you don't know who India Currents is, we are a Bay Area-based magazine that's been in publication for 30 years. It recently went digital, and we serve the South Asian diaspora in every form, whether that's literature, art, poetry, as you can see here, politics, current events, community-related things. So that's about India Currents. Matwaala is someone I was introduced, or the organization was a group I was introduced to when Matwaala reached out to India Currents to talk about their South Asian poetry wall at the Urban Museum and Archives in Dallas. And Matwaala is a collective forum to increase the visibility of South Asian poets. So what better platform than to join India Currents and Matwaala at this poetry reading? If you are on the BigStage platform, you can donate using the Donate to India Currents link at the top. You can send me your questions, but also you can see that the organizations that are working in collaboration with us. So you will see Matwaala's slider, and you can click on Matwaala to get to know more about them or to donate to them as well. I want to introduce my co-moderator, Kanchan Nayak. And she is someone that, is my partner in crime. So she's going to introduce the event.
All right. Thank you so much, Srishti, for that introduction. Thank you all for attending our second poetry reading of the year. So last time we had this wonderful opportunity to discuss global activism and its impact within the South Asian American diaspora and beyond, everything from feminism to the presidential race to the Black Lives Matter movement. It was an incredibly insightful conversation. So today we are very happy to continue that dialogue with our new theme, immigration and belonging in America. So one thing that we noticed is that the Indian American experience is often sculpted around the immigrant identity. And so that's something that we are very excited to explore during this poetry reading.
All right, so I'm just gonna run through the logistics of the event. The poets will speak for 10 minutes each with 2 to 3 minutes of Q&A by our moderators, which are me and Kanchan. At the end, we will have 10 to 15 minutes for questions, which can be submitted either via comments in the Facebook platform or through email, which if you are on the BigStage platform, you will see a button that says send us your questions. If you click on that, it will take you to editor@indiacurrents.com in order to ask your question or submit your comment. The other buttons you may see again are the donate buttons and the organizations that are affiliated, including BigStage, which is what we're using to stream this live. If you have any other questions, feel free to email me. I want to introduce Kanchan more deeply. She will be the co-moderator, and she is young but wise beyond her years. Kanchan is a rising senior at the Quarry Lane School in Dublin, California. And aside from being the youth editor at India Currents, Kanchan is the 2019-2020 Teen Poet Laureate of Pleasanton, and she uses her platform to advocate for minority and POC communities. She is a recipient of multiple poetry awards, including several national gold medals from the Scholastic Art and Writing Awards, and has read her work at events like MLK Junior Fellowship Breakfast and Pleasanton's Lighthouse Summer Workshop. She will also be reading her poetry at this event as a poet, so we're very, very lucky to have her on board. Thanks, Kanchan.
Thank you, Srishti. I'm very honored to be here with so many members of the literary community. So without further ado, our first poet of the evening is Karen Kapoor, the director of arts organization, the Tannery Series. Karen has spent years gifting the craft of poetry to the world. She is the winner of the Arts and Letters Rumi Prize and the recipient of the Anti-Venom Poetry Award for her first book, Visiting Indira Gandhi's Palmist. Currently, she teaches at Amherst College in Massachusetts. Thank you for joining us, Kiran.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And thanks so much to Matwaala for fostering such a wonderful community, and to India Currents for organizing this event. I'm going to start with a poem that's about being dead, and also about being American. It's about belonging to America in the most literal of senses and in the most metaphoric of senses. It's called From the Afterlife. I wanted to be a bone, white like the Taj Mahal, hard as a Puritan, when vain and wish are stripped, still able to rattle the essential notes. But no music gets made when you pit yourself against ideas of yourself. Dust suits me better. Gray-brown fleck, I can mix, move into the smallest space, spark the grittiest tunes. Divide me into 50 states, winsome, wondering, crazed, my face scattered by teaspoon. Over the great basin of played out mines and salts rising in a haze. Over hard-farmed heartland, the bent fair-headed wheat, the combine's cloud, silt along the fat lip of a riverbed, semis hissing and grumbling in tongues. I can still feel the hum of the telephone wires, running from one life to another. I filled those lines, in case a story is a body, in case we lose our place. Hello, friend? I can touch everything, but can't stop thinking. Turns out, thoughts granulate. Turns out, I never was a girl. I was all those girls, a girl statue, torch raised, you know the one, standing in the harbor, wearing a sari. The tide foams up. Now I'm so much dust, I'm a continent, absorbing, a thimbleful of mother, angry powder, laughing specks, froth, filth, lover, crying cinders, particles of mineral wind. I'm proof that nothing is lost. You can breathe me in. The next poem I'm going to read is one that I don't read very often, but it's about how we're labeled and counted. And so I thought it might be perfect for tonight. There's a chart right in the middle of the poem, which I won't read all of out loud, but I think there's some savvy screen sharing that might go on at some point, which will let you see all of it. The title of the poem comes from a line in Derek Walcott's great poem, Schooner Flight. Walcott was a mixed race poet like me, and in describing all the bloodlines of his heritage, he writes, either I'm nobody or I'm a nation. So this poem is called Nobody Nation. West. Out of the ribbons of heat, trumpets blaring, lights flashing rapturously, the state trooper directs us to the side of the Arizona highway, begins yelling at my father in Spanish. Red dust and sagebrush, and I know instinctively this isn't something I'm allowed to see. Try to train my eyes on saguaros. Earlier, as we'd wheeled down black tarmac, they'd stood like cartoon families, row after row of small gray sisters, large mothers of green, arms raised, come out with your hands up, a cactus game where little ones and big surrender over and over. I keep expecting my father will open his mouth and in spiked, precise English, quote Locke on rights accruing naturally. Instead, when I gather the courage to peek, he's inclining his earth-hewn head as the man shouts, comprendo, and I realize this is another language he has always known. East. In Nizamuddin Marketplace, my mother ponders piles of pail towels, a housewarming gift, as the man behind the counter flashes pawn-pinked teeth and assures her, finest quality, madam, 300 rupees. With a careful look at me, He says in Hindi, "Tell your mem sab it's a good price, and we'll split the overcharge, you and me, 50-50, like brother-sister." My mother smiles beatifically, her eyes tree green, by which she means for me to play along, keeping her Hindi secret. We're perfect in our parts. Me, the secret. She, the memsab to the hilt, ordering fleets of wiry attendants up ladders and down to the bottom of storage bins, sailing out with a package wrapped in string. In the street, I see her face is set like a plain white plate. But she motions to where I always beg for rosewater ice cream. I hand her the brother money, and under a sign where a rosy milkmaid dances for her blue-skinned lover, we spend our gains on sweets. South. I show my father a page of my 8th grade history textbook. Although the South was well known for its anti-miscegenation policies, most states had similar laws. State, Arizona, first law passed, 1865. Law repealed, 1962. Races banned from marrying whites, Blacks, Asians, Filipinos, Indians. Note, Filipinos or Malays and Indians or Hindus added to the list of races in 1931. California, first law passed 1850, law repealed 1948. Races banned from marrying whites, Blacks, Asians, Filipinos. Idaho, 1864, repealed 1959. Races banned from marrying whites, Blacks, Native Americans, Asians. Nevada, 1861, law repealed 1959. Races banned from marrying whites, Blacks, Native Americans, Asians, Filipinos. On and on it goes. Colorado, North Dakota, Indiana, Oregon, 1955, 57, 63, 65. My father considers the page, hums a little tunelessly, then lashes his newspapers back into place, creaseless, tall and straight. On the black and white columns, figures seem to twist and fly. At first, I think it's Urdu script, but when I refocus my eyes, I'm facing the messages of the New York Times. North. It's the wife who shows me how to top and tail French green beans, placing the knife at a 45-degree angle, so the slender bodies taper, artfully, she says. Her husband watches election season commentary on the kitchen TV. They're throwing a dinner party. I'm earning my books and cigarettes, and everything feels bright under recessed halogens. During commercial break, the husband casually, "So tell me, are you a citizen?" The beans are stacked neatly on a chilled glass tray, and I wonder if he means, "Can you vote?" Or, "Will I have to pay you under the table?" The guests drift in. I blanch and plate and scrub their tile clean. It isn't until I'm enjoying the Volvo's heated seats, watching the snowbanks streaked with road debris, that he puts his hand on my knee. The moon dips low. I'm only a few minutes from home, and I know. Pacific. When my father becomes a citizen, they retake his fingerprints repeatedly. Outside, there are coconut trees, and the sun is headed for the sea. "I'm sorry, sir," says the officer good-naturedly. "You're a man of mystery. All the identifying whorls have worn away." They're forced to press his palms to their forms. As we leave, traveling a long hall lined with portraits of past presidents, my father whispers to me, "I kept the good lines for myself." I'm going to finish with a poem that's about a different sort of belonging. It's called "For the Survivors." Begin with the seed. Begin with the father and the mother, your first Adam and Eve. Begin with what falls from the tree. You can live unbruised and sweet. Begin with a monsoon breeze. begin with a flood. Begin with miles of silk and mud and the wings of cranes and the stilt-like legs of a house with no one left inside. With a young wife burying her sons and books riding the tide until they're caught and their philosophies dried out on laundry lines. Begin with a pen, begin with a cage, begin with the memory of what they said while you tried to turn your face away. Begin with bargains, with stains, the names of towns built over graves. Begin with your life burned down, with the god who hasn't been seen since the burning bush, and the goddess who steps into the flames like a housewife into a dress, or a fairy tale of hair so long that love climbed up. Begin by putting your mouth to the mouth of your dreams. Begin with tendons, teeth. Begin with what never goes away, a highway pricked by gravel and stars, low beams on wind and trucks and emptiness. Begin. It starts with being, ends like a ringing bell. Begin, begin, ring yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Kieran. Oh, go ahead, Kanchan.
Oh, I was going to say that was beautiful, Kieran. Let me actually go ahead and share my screen so we can pull up that chart that you featured in Nobody Nation. All right, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
All right, perfect, thank you. So Shrishti and I were both actually very curious about this chart. We were both wondering, what it was like for you to combine this, very widely different, very quantitative medium with the rest of your poems, and what that was like for you.
Well, I think it's the only sort of instance of me including that kind of sort of visual piece of information, although there's lots of history in the book and lots of quotations and kind of drawing from other voices and other sources. But I think this is the only piece that has this kind of a visual sense to it. And it was strange. I think actually it's what dictated the shape of the rest of the poem. This poem is a prose poem. Each of the sections are in blocks and they're quite kind of rectangular looking. And I think that came out of coping with the shape of the graph, and also with the fact that this graph, not this exact one, but one like it, is something that I came across in a school textbook. And that sent me back to that era of sort of dioramas and these small little, boxes with a whole narrative story inside. And so that inspired the shape of the poem, where each section is a kind of block of text with a full little vignette, sort of like you would have in a school diorama. So I suppose in a sense, the chart had a lot to do with how the poem came into being.
That's wonderful. That's so interesting. I love the idea that the chart's shape later influenced like the entire structure and shape of your poem.
Yeah, that was wonderful to hear. Our next question is about your poem For the Survivors. You have a lot of references to women and their identities, and there's so many of them. And Kanchan and I were just trying to figure out whose identities were you playing off of. So I thought it would be nice if you could elaborate a little more on that.
Well, in that poem comes towards the end of my first book. And kind of through the book, there have been a variety of characters. There's a mother and a father who bear some resemblance to my own mother and father. There are characters from the Bible who appear in the book. And there are also characters from Hindu mythology as well. So I think in that poem, sort of many of those sources came together and sort of spilled over one into the other in a way that I hope the book kind of came together in that same way. And in terms of the pacing and the sound and all those things, I think I wanted them to to be inextricable from each other, whereas in other poems that had come before, the narratives were separate. And here those narratives are condensed and they're linked by the form of the poem and the rhyme and the meter of the poem, kind of tying them all together.
Yeah, I definitely think that the theme of your poetry, which is a lot of mixture of Eastern and Western thought, came through pretty vividly to Kanchan and I. And I think Kanchan's next question is actually about this, so I'll let her speak.
Sure. So one thing that, as Shrishti was saying, we both noticed, especially in your first poem, was sort of this kind of the way that you infused both Eastern and Western cultures, where you juxtapose the white of the Taj Mahal with the dust of the Great Basin. And Shrishti and I were wondering if you could actually elaborate on that, the way that you kind of, seamlessly move between these two cultures and two schools of thought almost.
Well, I think it's not a conscious activity for me. I think it's just a function of who I am. I think it's who I am in terms of my personal background. I've spent my whole life moving between those places, but doing it in a poem is a different kind of maneuver and does require, I think, some conscious thought. When I first put that first book together, I showed it to a very dear poet mentor, and he read through the poems and he said, I love all these poems individually, but when I read them, I have sort of whiplash. Am I in the East? Am I in the West? I'm in America. I'm in Pakistan. It's 1948. It's the present day. He just had a hard time sort of moving between them. And of course, that had never occurred to me because that's how I live. I've spent my whole life going back and forth, and the events of the past were very present in my house growing up. And so the idea that I would be both in 1948 and the present day doesn't seem unusual to me. But it occurred to me that for a reader, that is not the case. And so a big part of the work I did on that book was figuring out how to move between those worlds and those places in a way that's fruitful for the reader, as well as honest to the experience I wanted to portray.
That's wonderful. I love the fact that you include so much from both, the East and the West, because, as Indian Americans, I feel like often our identities are considered fragmented, so to speak, because, we take so much from both cultures. So I love the way that your poems just perfectly encapsulate that. Thank you so much for sharing.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Our next poet of the evening is Ralph Nazareth, a poet, teacher, and publisher. The author of 4 poetry books, his work has appeared in books, magazines, and journals here and abroad. Ralph has taught poetry virtually everywhere, in schools, colleges, universities, even maximum security prisons. Aside from being the managing editor of Yugantha Press, he also heads international nonprofit organization Graceworks Incorporated. Thank you for joining us, Ralph. Ralph, you're muted.
Thank you very much, Kanchan and Shrishti. I also want to thank Usha Akella and Pramila Venkateshwaran, the founders of Matwaala, for creating all these connections. It's extraordinary. And thanks also to the Zoom mechanism for bringing us together across borders and across states, sometimes across, from around the globe. So thank you very much. The first poem I'll read is Red Eye. It's, you'll see it's about transition, moving from one place to another. Red Eye. In the curved blue jeweled space, the reading lamplight floods the narrow seat next to mine. A man with the wise profile of Cyrus the Great moves his finger purposefully along lines written in Farsi. Now and then he invokes God's blessings on my sneezes, issuing with the plosive hiss of curses. and then returns to the script I sense is hidden revelation. There must be others here flying east in this pocket of darkness, whose lips are sealed over foreign tongues like ours, hearts locked with the secrets of their native realms, minds silently working out strategies of survival, flecks of feelings percolating privately, crisscrossed fingers and visions resting under blankets, warm with the gold wings of the TW insignia. In this sleek shuttle of the night, poised to pierce the water light of embryonic dawn, travelers all, stewards of the earth, we dream red-eyed. He alone keeps vigil with the lines which move unmoving through the shivering of the plain and seem to breathe. Stay awake, so you may know the beginning and the end of things. The second poem is quite different in feel. So here we go. Orientation for new immigrants. So you want to fit in? Okay then. The first step you must take is to learn to say fuck without blushing. Say fuck and once more fuck. And not wilt at every time you hear it, which would be every other step, as your American counterparts take it on whatever's in their path. The fucking door, the fucking tree, the fucking bush. No, not the president, of course. God bless America. But the bush that just sits there and doesn't do anyone any harm, doesn't declare dead or alive or bring them on. Strut on decks of warships in borrowed fighter pilot's gear, doesn't proclaim mission accomplished in the bud like a premature ejaculation, doesn't chant ad nauseam, we will prevail, and all options are on the table. You are with us or against us. God is on our side. It is just an innocuous, unremarkable, ordinary, plain as fucking plain can be bush. If you wish to go deeper into this culture, to climb the Trump Tower faster, be top dog, you may not want to stop with fuck. Go further, the whole hog and enchilada, as they say, the whole fucking 9 yards, and practice say, fuck piss shit, as often as you hear them. Practice, practice, practice makes fucking perfect. All right. This has a long title. Allen Ginsberg, It's Two Leonards, shows me the democratic vistas of unending cheeses, walks me past singing cows, banjo-strumming bands, and the 7 deadly sins, chief among them, gluttony, and talks to me with Buddha compassion at the checkout counter. I need you, Alan, to tell me, go ahead, bury your head in peppers. It's ostrich-like, I know, but see what happened to our heroes. I need you, Alan, to show me how to clown my way to wisdom, monkey or no monkey on my back. I need you, Alan, to show me how to look the world in the eye while my eyes fill up with sorrow. I need you, Alan, to tell me it's okay, buddy. You fell asleep when I'd asked you to stay awake and touch. I am, don't you see, all forgiveness. See how the milk flows from my almost mother breasts, my Blake and Whitman breasts. Come lay your heavy head on me and drink. There's more where it came from, for I have a direct line to the goddess. I wrote her a Kaddish and she wrote me a blank check. Drink, baby, drink, and don't worry about growing up. I need you, Alan, to remind me of my ancestors, like them or not, That's where the songs come from and the curses. And we must know them both and hold them in till our holy throats croak and our holy sphincters burst. And there is the pralaya, and the night will not end until we say, brothers and sisters, we're okay. It's not our fault. We knew about it, but it's not our fault. Could have, would have, should have done something about it, but we didn't. Why blame us? We are only children of your long sleep, your very long, unending mother dream. I need you, Alan, to take inventory of all the crimes, big and little, make long lists of everyone's follies, take pot shots at top dogs, hideous little curs, not spare the Pope or the Dalai Lama, not spare you or me. We're all part, aren't we, of this whirling mire, but we just see her smile and know how cruel she is to let children be bombed in shelters or die at dry dugs in the Bronx and in Rwanda. I need you, Alan, to sing of all your loves, big and little, and of your goddamn sphincter. May it be loose and relaxed as long as there are penises, fingers, Coke bottles, carrots, and bananas. And may it take its rightful place beside the Sacred Heart, the jewel in the lotus, brain cells, Perlman's fingers, Subbulakshmi's voice, Fisher's antics, Stiglitz's eyes, and Gandhi's bowel movements. I need you, Alan, to waver as sometimes even you do get that sad glint in your eye, write a funny epitaph, and even as you joke about dying, know and show and tell how this is all we have got, and what a shame it is that we must give it up. It's not just the sphincter, damn it, it's also the spring in the window, the birds in the air, deep, deep loves that will not go away. No matter what is right and what is wrong, no matter how awful the betrayal, how shocking the scandal, there's this thing that sticks to the skin of your shining soul like love. They say it is love, and you don't know what to do about it, but just keep licking it as a puppy licks its paw, as good as a milk bone, but powerful. I need you, Alan, to stand naked under the stars before audiences and presidents, before CEOs and the annual meetings of the American Poetry Society, before the likes of Cavett and Buckley, the hocus pocus pundits drinking chai under the trees in Benares, and say to them, Eke homo, homa homunculus, behold the man, woman, child, behold innocence, awkwardness, and beauty, behold this missile of envy, behold this poisonous launching pad, behold the sunflower spewing seed for 1,000,000 earths. I need you, Alan, to tell me to remember the future. The universe is a person, first thought, best thought, candor ends paranoia, as you savor vowels of joy and appreciate consonants of tragic wisdom, sitting on a boulder in Colorado. I need you, Alan, to make sense of not making sense. I need you, Alan, like a shot in the arm. I need you, Alan, like a shot in the head. I need you, Alan, to be my flight of angels playing the silly harmoniums, plucking the drone strings of eternity, bringing me my Sominex. I need you, Alan, to tell me, you sure have a funny name for an Indian, but go ahead and tell the world your story anyway, anyway, your own little story anyway, anyway. Do I have one more minute? One last poem.
You have 1 more minute.
Okay. Who else to follow Allen Ginsberg than Walt Whitman, his mentor and our forefather, so to say. Sunday morning with Walt, it has an epigraph. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. Walt Whitman. The brick oven roars, the steaming bagels lifted out on smoking paddles sizzle in the arcing air and thud into labeled bins, warm in diversity. Sesame, poppy, oatmeal, plain, salt, pumpernickel, black, brown, yellow, pale glowing orbs, burnished gold, some with everything. In line this Sunday morning, I celebrate myself and sing myself. And what I assume, you shall assume. for every bagel that belongs to me as well belongs to you. Thank you.
Your poems were wonderful, Ralph. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
To kick off the questions that Shrishti and I have for you, we want to start with your poem dedicated to Allen Ginsberg. So let me go ahead and share my screen to pull that up. All right. You know what was interesting is I remember you kind of compared your poem once to an impassioned plea.
Yes.
And hearing you read it now, I think that perfectly encapsulates your poem for sure. Wow, what can I say about this poem? So one question that I did have was, for those of us who don't know who Allen Ginsberg is, I was wondering if you could, kind of talk a little bit about why you dedicated this poem to him.
Yeah, well, when I was a 23-year-old young man and I came to this country in that fateful year, 1968, I had the good fortune of hearing all these great poets, from Robert Lowell, Denise Levertov, Robert Duncan, Allen Ginsberg, Gary Snyder. It was just a feast, even as America was plundering Vietnam at that time. And Allen Ginsberg was the great voice of conscience. He was a beat poet and already had made a mark. And he was very much into, Indian lore, and he looked like a sadhu. And he had this crazy little harmonium, always with the drone sing, and he used to chant. And there's so much of Allen Ginsberg that's available online. For us, he was a voice of sanity, basically, because he was pulling together all this wisdom, both Hindu and Buddhist wisdom, and seeding his extraordinary American experience with all of that. And so it was a tremendous synthesis of a profound analytical understanding of the violence that this country was based in, starting with genocide and then slavery, you see, all the way to the dropping of the bombs and Vietnam and Cambodia. And that's when Allen Ginsberg was one of our sort of soul mates and inspiration for all of us. Yeah, and he was really one of the seminal poets of the period. And just like Walt Whitman, Allen Ginsberg will have a kind of a permanent place in American poetry because it's an inimitable, impassioned voice. So my poem basically picks up on his energy, and it is a cri de coeur. It's a cry of the heart. I'm so desperate most of the time, thinking about the fact that I've been here for 52 years. That is much longer than you and Shrishti have been on this planet. And in some ways, I am complicit in the violence of this country. And also I celebrate with Whitman and Ginsberg the great glories and the potential of this nation. This country has so many blessings that can do so much all over the world if it wanted to, if it had the will. So, it's a mixed blessing. And so this poem comes from that place of desperation, but it was also a way to pull together the whole world that meant a lot to me. And Allen Ginsberg was the conduit for that.
Wow.
I can see that even within your poem, Sunday Morning with Walt, which I'm assuming is Walt Whitman. And in your prelude, you actually discuss atoms belonging to individuals. Kanchan, can you pull up the poem?
Yep, just doing that right now. There we go.
So yeah, you have this poem short poem by Walt Whitman. And I think it's interesting because we saw this, comparison you were making with bagels. And we just wanted to know if you wanted to talk a little bit about it, because I think we found it as like a unifying token that you put in. And as you were saying, like, we've been so divided, and I felt this was like one piece that really felt unifying, as opposed to even the one where you talk about saying fuck all the time. So yes. Yeah, can you talk a little bit about it?
Of course. There's nobody like Walt Whitman, the one who contains multitudes, right? Some of Walt Whitman is problematic. He was the poet of that period, and there are certain references that are uncomfortable. But on the whole, Walt Whitman is this great capacious spirit. He is really, for me, the patron saint of this country, okay? So I'm drawing on his strength, and I also want to contain the multitudes. And often, my poetry readings tend to be a little bit on the downside, and I always tell the audience that I'm going to try and leave them not in the slough of despondence, but with with a kind of an uplifted mood. And I often end my readings with this poem because it, first of all, puts me in the American scene with Walt, and then standing in line for the Sunday morning bagel is as American as it can be. I am an Indian standing with him. And of course, these bagels in their diversity, all sorts of bagels are available, including a bagel with everything on it, right? So for me, it is an image of absolute human community. And there is no experiment in the world in communitarian living as the United States of America. This is the great experiment. And this is where the source of my desperation is, that we are throwing it away. We're throwing it away. I mean, this country has the ability to lead the way to what it means to be inclusive society, right? And again, my desperation is coming out. But as you can see, there's nothing like going to a bagel shop and be embraced and surrounded by the smell of the fresh bagels, and the warm, fresh bagels, and the oven there, and the paddles and stuff like that. So it has a kind of a sustaining power to it.
Thank you, Ralph. Kanchan, if you want to say your closing comments.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's so amazing that you have so much historical context behind your poetry. So many subtleties and nuances in your work that Shrishti and I really enjoyed, taking apart and then putting back together again. Thank you so much for sharing your poetry.
Oh, thank you both. Actually, let me say this, the two of you have paid more attention to my poems than just about anybody else has. So a big, big thank you to you both.
That makes us feel wonderful. All right. Yeah, so our next poet is, it's me. Let me go ahead and just first of all, I just want to thank all of you and Matwaala. I'm very honored to be here with all of you. I'm more than excited. The title of my first poem is An Open Letter to Girls at Coachella. It's kind of my personal stance on cultural appropriation and the way that traditions I've grown up with are affected by it. So here goes. An open letter to girls at Coachella who like sporting bindis and calling them eye dots, the California sun melting their makeup as they breathe in the desert air. Wouldn't it be funny if your third eye just happened to open that day and a fleshy Indian snake slithered down your spray tan neck, hissing in your ear as an elephant tail whacked the iced kombucha out of your hand? Wouldn't it be funny if you happened to find a thread of prayer beads in your matted hair and your skin started to look purple and there was the stinging tip of Shiva's trident nearly piercing the flesh of your chest? Wouldn't it be funny if suddenly the culture you've enjoyed picking apart just happened to cling to you in a way that isn't normal to you, directed at you, or perhaps most importantly, convenient for you? So my next poem, Ode to Cardamom Children, kind of veers towards more personal territory for me regarding my relationship with India, what it means to be a second generation South Asian, and, kind of growing distant from my cultural heritage. Ode to Cardamom Children. We who were told by our mothers to find the veins in our spices, the brittle rivulets carved into the skeletons of fennel and cumin seeds, we opened their hearts with the kiss of a pestle. It was fenugreek who taught us spices were courted and not conquered. We can't seem to remember when we widowed our own taste buds. Rosemary died twice, buried beneath our tongues and cremated in garnish. The crackle of a tawa, our epithet. Now, only cardamom survives the stomach of our mother's mortars, bruised and scalded, forced into mouths struggling to forget. Only mothers speak to ghosts, and when the veins of cardamom are wrenched open, they bleed into our fingernails, the price of a daughter's adultery. My next poem, which is titled Open, kind of discusses the nature of xenophobia in our country and what it means to rise above that. I was actually inspired to write this piece after reading more about this terrible hate crime that occurred in June when this Indian restaurant in New Mexico was vandalized. So here goes, Open. At the Chot House on the end of South Avenue, wedged between the Italian restaurant and the slow-dying bookstore, I stare at the closed sign's obituary. The books groan against the window display. Not loathed, just unloved. But the Chot House burns with the struggle to live. The bruised walls blackened with the spidery handwriting of the Gora. As the mouth of the spray gun spits on a cluster of Bollywood posters, inky blood trickles from Paki, terrorist. The man wrote, "Go back to your own country," but the Chot House on the end of South Avenue is a country within a country where browns and whites are immigrants alike, seeking refuge in spoonfuls of saffron and cumin and ladles of the brown man's simple dream. In haste, he left the Chot House for dead, but still it refused to perish because the Diwali string lights coiled around the window panes are still gently flickering. The Indian magazines still fluttering in bitter autumn wind, because tomorrow the tearful brown man will still hang a plastic sign that says open, welcoming a world so desperate to keep him out. My next poem, which is titled Obituary to the Lost Lingua, is kind of my ode to the ways that I've lost my mother tongue over the years. So I'm actually a Konkani speaker, but my parents grew up in Bombay. So kind of in this race to learn Hindi and then later Spanish, Konkani has kind of taken a step back, and I really regret losing that tongue. So here's my poem, Obituary to the Lost Lingua. We did not have a name to bury you with, because what name would we give you? Children are to be named, dogs and mountains, and your soul the weight of every syllable, your arms outstretched in our every elegy. We tasted your feathers against the backs of our tongue. We breathed the burden of your silence. We will be here with our names and our hollows, choking the hearts of our children until they exhale your ghost. And where will we go when we laugh in a language that hardens against our throats, that bends only until our vowels curve into the arch of a teardrop? And where will we go when every face that finds us becomes the frown of a father, murmuring with concern? How will we answer him that asks, "And whom do you mourn?" when we did not have a name to bury you with? So my next poem, Duke and the Boys, it kind of focuses on the cognitive dissonance that personally I think is employed by people who subscribe to, racist or bigoted ideologies in the United States. And I think that that's kind of used to support their rhetoric. So just to preface this poem, I have this epigraph from a former white nationalist leader, David Duke, which is, "I don't call myself a white supremacist. I'm a civil rights activist concerned about European American rights." So essentially, I think that's sort of the heart of my poem. It kind of focuses on this quote and kind of attempts to negate that sort of idea. So here goes. Duke and the boys bisect sun-stained valleys, trickling into desert. They bear their fathers' names on their backs like crumbling slabs of stone. They throw themselves into sand that readily swallows their fried-fed frames and clothes them in Abel's colors. The sun pricks Duke, and the boys against their southern skin. They rise, a white river of light, surging beneath the sky's open prison. The tide bathes them in their amnesiac reflection. It grows dark, and a cross is doused in kerosene for a little warmth. Duke stares ahead, past the black shadow of a man bleeding into his melted spine. Where corn snake country blooms, a cotton rose floats in gurgling moonlight. All right, thank you for bearing with me. My final poem is called To Proud Boys, and it's sort of a sequel to my last piece. I think with topics like immigration and race, there's always middle ground to be found, whether it be politically or personally. And so this poem is sort of dedicated to that, to Proud Boys. Your flag is the color of sun-stained backs, drenched in the blood of their brothers, drowned by the stifling stench of cotton residue, drizzled in gashes ruptured by men who looked so much like you. Your stars were once stitched from bruised fingers in bare attics, every thread tamed into fabric you hoist into a screaming sky. Perhaps you won't hear me over the whistle of pepper spray, but damn, I would walk across this injured American earth that belongs to its wounds and whisper in your ears. The brown man cries not of the burden on his back, but because the others think so deeply of their own. But alas, this earth between us, ablaze in nervous laughter, laughter at the sightless pride of a boy. All right, and that's my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Kanchan. I feel truly blessed, and I'm sure the readers do too, that we have such a wide range of perspectives of different with people with differing paths in immigration and generational just generational existence within America. Because as someone that is a first generation Indian American, I'm slightly older than you and slightly younger than the rest, I find myself kind of resonating on both ends. So this has been so wonderful to hear from you. In your poem about Duke and the Boys, and you kind of talk about it in your poem that follows after, you talk about the physical burden that they bear. And initially you talk about that burden being associated with a name. So I just wanted you to elaborate on that idea. Where did you get that from?
Sure, I think the reason I decided to associate the idea of their names being carried on their backs is because, in my opinion, it's often true that ideas around race, immigration, even perhaps our political ideologies at that, are very hereditary. And so growing up in an immigrant home, I know what it feels like often to sort of both agree with, but also negate the ideas that come from my family. And so that's just something that I wanted to acknowledge over there, sort of like the hereditary nature of perhaps where we stand. Yeah, I absolutely agree that no matter what your race is, you are bearing the burden of your ancestors. So I really, really liked that, that you made that connection. In your other poem, Cardamom Children, you end with the image of cardamom bleeding into your fingernails. So what is your relationship with spices, and how does that relate to your journey with immigration and your Indian American identity? Sure. So when I tend to think about, my, as you said, Indian American identity, I think the first image or the first memory that comes into mind is sort of my mom handing me a mortar and a pestle and telling me to ground spices. So I thought, why not play on that with this poem? I think the reason I decided to end with that image is sort of this idea of how spices physically can't seem to leave me the same way that the Indian side of my identity can't leave me either. And so I think to answer your question, that's why I decided to end with that. Wonderful. I feel similarly. I still grind. So I think my favorite poem was probably your open letter on cultural appropriation at Coachella. And
it's just, you used so many symbolisms from, you know, our culture that we're seeing today, and then also from our Indian background. So I just want you to talk about why that was an open letter as opposed to one to just, you know, millennials and Gen Zers, because I'm sure maybe half of the population watching this right now might not know what Coachella is and why, you know, cultural appropriation is a thing at Coachella. So I think you should maybe inform everybody a little bit about it.
Sure. So Coachella is a very popular music festival, and it's, you know, something that's deeply rooted in pop culture right now. And so, although I love all music festivals, and I think it's wonderful that we really get to showcase so many different cultures and show appreciation for so many, you know, different countries at Coachella. I think one problem that's, I wouldn't say is endemic to just the music festival itself, but rather to just our country as a whole, is this issue with cultural appropriation, where we often just take different aspects of a culture that we seem convenient or fashionable to use without necessarily paying homage to the places where they come from. And I think that's really problematic, because I don't know about everyone else here, but as a second generation immigrant, I've often been almost taught to feel ashamed of certain aspects of my culture, like that's something that I should hide. And so when I see other people who, without that kind of context, just try to use certain things that they consider trendy for my heritage, it feels a little upsetting for me. And so I decided to dedicate my poem to that. I think
I could not agree more with the cultural appropriation aspect being used as something trendy. I don't know if this happened to you growing up, but if I brought Indian food to school, you know, people would make fun of it or call it poop, or, you know, there were a slew of insults. And so it's interesting to see our culture become something that this next generation is using for like, you know, pop culture purposes. And I like that you have a fresh perspective on Coachella, because I agree. That said, Kanchan, your time is over, so thank you so much. And we're going to introduce Kanchan back as the moderator to introduce the next poet.
All right, I'm back. So up next, we have Gita Sukumaran. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. A poet, translator, and doctoral student in humanities at Toronto's York University. She has published 2 books in Tamil, which includes her own work, as well as a Tamil translation of Sylvia Plath's poems. Her English translations of Tamil poems, meanwhile, have appeared in several publications, including Modern Poetry in Translation. Thank you so much for joining us, Gita.
Thank you, Kanchan and Srishti, for having this actually a very deep conversation on poetry. And I should thank India Currents and Matwaala for having this platform where it's loved by poets and poetry lovers alike together. I write in Tamil, and the poems I'm reading tonight are translated by Vidya Srinivasan. As most of you are already aware, Toronto is a home for immigrants from many countries. Economic migrants, exile seekers, refugees all breathe life into the city in myriad forms and colors. So obviously the themes of separations, lost love in faraway lands remain forever beyond expressions. This poem imagines Nappinai, very much like Radha, is a consort of Krishna, familiar only in the Tamil culture, facing the everlasting question, where do you come from? Nappinai's thirst. The flat disks, motionless papers dissolve into the air's moisture in the convergences and the divergences of the city's streets. Beneath chests, hips, and backs, wrapped with the skin of the city, dilapidated bridges, streets, birds that crash to death on buildings, hands burning inside restaurants, memories and their trickles, dry on black winter clothes and crystallize the frozen surface of the lake into insoluble salt. In another glass cubicle across the road, tongues laced with salt and thirst are strangled by nameless voices and crushed in heated breath. In the street that halves both cubicles, the blue cloud that floats on car windows slips into the door at the touch of a button. While waiting for the bus and freezing in the cold, words that fly in the street burn us with a coal-like warmth. Fear-blanched faces shake with the beating of the heart. Passionately held kisses all pass us by. At the time when paper roses and Christmas decorations ooze over and fill the streets, bleeding red into both class cubicles and making them one, what would you say, Napinnai, to her who asks, where do you come from? Of the banks of the gushing river of desire, of the heat of its proximity, of the other bank that frosts far away, would you speak of him who becomes thirst on your tongue? The next poem is, living in Toronto, one cannot avoid conversations about conflicts, war, violence, groceries, hospitals, takeouts, workplace, even at the most unexpected spaces and gatherings. Someone always tells me a story from their traumatic past in my language or in broken English. This is one such conversation between two women who share the same workspace and are from different worlds, one an economic migrant, the other a refugee. A conversation. The woman tending the garden terrace at my workplace told me her wages for watering unfamiliar plants while recollecting her memories in unaccustomed English. As bombs fell, dust that rose up from people scattering penetrated my eyes, obscured the path. Treading through the midnight darkness, we reached a shelter. In the oilless pan, rosemary cooks with sunberry leaves I had found between the crevices of the cement wall. I exchanged curry leaves with flour to nurture our lives, which refused to yield. She continued, her fingers covered with pot soil. The ground grabbed from my feet that cannot be reclaimed by anyone clings to the roots of spinach stalks and herbs swelling in my palm. As her wringing hands and moist eyelashes uncover the rest of her experiences, lines of water descended from the sky when my heart mellowed. Forgetting her pain momentarily, trying to make a poem about the smell of rain that is the same across the earth. Drenched in the rain, walking past me, she said, the smell of new cement and aluminum sheets that drink water is the same in all cities as they become home to refugees. This poem is about a common experience of an immigrant at any workplace. Skin. From the photograph on the coffee table, bearing the nameplate of Megan Wood, golden strands, teasing blue eyes touch my dark brown fingers that rested on the computer for long. Megan Wood's friend asked, is she away just for today or the entire week? As I went to get coffee, another question from another who had not yet smiled. Is Megan Wood unwell or just on vacation? Beneath the gilded inquiries, the glistening truth. Are you taking over her job? I replied calmly, I'm just doing her work for today. The white icebergs slowly loosened. My final poem is a reflection of Sujata Bhatt's Search for My Tongue. The poem opens with her lines and unravels the thoughts of an immigrant woman who moves between landscapes, cultures, and languages. Her persona is characterized by this duality that engages in a conversation within her and Sujata Bhatt. Past and present constantly intertwine in her language. Sujata's two tongues. What would you do if you had two tongues in your mouth, asked Sujata Bhatt. Hauling into winter clothes, the hair frozen in the snowy cold to wires, beyond the fragrance of Arapu, and her body that slips on the white street, she asks, நாவுகள் மட்டுமா? அவளது கண்களோடு பிணைந்திருக்கும் எனது கண்களை ஆடையொட்டிய அமராவதி ஆற்றங்கரை மணலை இருட்டு புகை மண்டிய இட்லி வாசனையை என்ன செய்யட்டும்? Just tongues. My eyes entwined in hers, clothes stuck to the sand of Amaravati's riverbank, the aroma of idlis laid with dark smoke. What should I do? As one tongue settles in between the teeth with questions, another hides in the thick eyeliner. A native song unraveling from a wooden flute disrupts the daily conversations of the cell phone. I go near their house. They, on the other hand, have never come and have never told me, my brother, I know your ancestors. விழிகளிலிருந்து எட்டி பார்ப்பவள் சொல்கிறாள், உனது வீட்டின் பின்னால் இருக்கும் ஏரியின் நீளம் எங்கே கரைந்தது? தேநீர் கடை கோப்பையின் ஆவியில் அவிகிறது நீர், நிறம், பச்சை, நெல், தவளை, அணில். Where did the blue of the lake behind your house dissolve? The one peeping out from her eyes asks. In the steaming of the cup at the tea house dissipate water, color, green, rice, frog, squirrel. The four eyes never disappear. When the golden chain flowers become wings in two eyes, the wake of the slave ships flowing at the feet of the dark body, curly-haired, wets two eyes. Sujata சொல்கிறாள், தாய்மொழியை நான் மறக்கவில்லை. நான் சொன்னேன், எனது தாய்மொழி சமையல் அறையில் எரிந்து கொண்டிருக்கிறது தினமும். I haven't forgotten my mother tongue, Sujata says. I said, my mother tongue burns in my kitchen every day. Thank you.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much, Gita.
Thank you.
Just to begin my questions for you, and this is a little bit more of a personal thing, but as someone who's also, trying to explore the bilingual sphere of poetry, I was wondering how you managed to sort of move between, move between both Tamil and English all in one poem.
When I write, writing always comes to me in Tamil, like it's the creative language. So I write in Tamil. And then as I read the translation, I did realize that it's actually the culture, the language that comes into play. So then I did both the original and the translation I put together. And that's when I thought the poem was complete to convey the sense what I was trying to say with Sujata Bhatt's poem.
That's wonderful. Shrishti, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I actually was wondering about the translation. So obviously when you're writing in Tamil, there's a very different flow, the way that you pause, just the way that you roll your R's and things like that. So how does it feel to have someone translate it? Does it accurately depict your poetry, do you feel?
I think the question or the sense of accurate is a bit difficult when it comes to poetry, because not all of it, as a translator, I do see that, especially when words in the original language, they combine like at least 2 or 3 meanings together in one language. And to capture that in English is a bit difficult, given that English is a language which has specific words for each and every action or every description that the original language has. So then, as much as one can capture the poetic sense with the meaning, and obviously rhythm is always lost in translation, and there is always room for so much creativity in each language that reflects the original. That's where I think you can stop, but then as a poet, you can stop with your poetry, but as a translator, you're never satisfied. You can never stop the act of translating.
Yeah, and I see that you have that through line even in your poem, A Conversation, right? Because you're talking about replacing curry leaves and using rosemary, which is not, usually what you use in Indian food. So I actually wanted to hear more about it. Like, is that kind of resonate with how you write your poetry too, where you're utilizing different words in English and replacing them? And, is that something that you feel as well?
Actually, in that particular poem, I wanted to fuse that the notion of refugee is not just limited to one place or one continent. It's like across, you can see like from so many communities and so many countries. So I was like trying to like tease that with the herbs that I use so that it just doesn't belong to one place or one language, one ethnicity.
Thank you so much, Gita, for that beautiful message. Kanchan, would you like to introduce the next poet?
Yes.
Thank you.
So our next poet of the evening, and actually the one to close off this wonderful session, is Pushcart Prize-winning poet, editor, translator, and processor Ravi Shankar. He has published, edited, or has forthcoming over 15 books, including the Muse India award-winning translations of 9th century Tamil poet Ando. He currently holds an international research fellowship from the University of Sydney, and his memoir, Correctional, is forthcoming in 2021 with the University of Wisconsin Press. Thank you so much, Ravi.
Ravi, just before you start, we will be having an open forum, so please either send your questions using the button that says send us your questions, or send your questions at editor.indiacurrents.com, or you can write your questions in the Facebook comments below. This will be the last poet, so after this, the public forum discussion will begin. Thank you. All right, you're ready, Ravi.
Great. Thank you all. And thank you to India Currents and to Matwaala, to Usha and Pramila for setting this up. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. And the work that India Currents does, I mean, actually, in a way, you know, becoming a writer was quite radical for my family, being typically South Asian. And even when I got a graduate degree and I published a book, none of it mattered. And then one of my books was reviewed in India Abroad. And then all of a sudden it legitimized in some way what I was doing. So these kinds of papers, I think, really make a difference in creating community. And so I'm so glad that you're supporting the arts and literature and poetry. So I would love to begin, and it was so wonderful to hear your Tamil, Gita. Thank you for that. If I had known, I would have read some translations of the Andal, but I have some different poems, and I wanted to start actually with this poem, which I was going to read anyway, but because of the news of Jacob Blake, yet another man of color who was shot by officers unarmed in Wisconsin, I thought I would start with this poem, which is in light of the real brutality that we're seeing, seems kind of benign, but of course it's not. And this is about the stop and frisk policy that was happening in New York that was ultimately found unconstitutional. But according to, and their little epigraph here, according to their own explanation for their actions, NYPD officers conducted at least 170,000 unlawful stops between 2004 and 2009. And so this poem, it's a sonnet, but it's kind of a strange sonnet because it uses anagrams in lieu of rhymes at the end. And so it's the same word, but the letters rearranged, which you might hear an echo of. And it's called the Suspicious Bulge, which was one of the categories that the NYPD could use when they wanted to stop or arrest someone. Things like furtive movements and a suspicious bulge were enough to kind of to stop someone and racially profile them. So the Suspicious Bulge. It was a plush bear, a ruddy pear stuck in a satchel. My bad diet of lager and lollipops. Oolong teas imported from the eclectic East, according to the bright label tops. The can of Spam a black man eats when being falsely accused of rape because his hoodie has been tied by a state's witness to a nearby spot. It was a suede sofa cushion seat. It was a care package I needed to post. A bonsai tree I planned to pair later. Was a book on how to reap serenity. Officer, no need to edit. Why the fuck did I have to stop? Hopefully it feels like we're on the precipice of some change, positive change happening, and I hope that's the case. And this next poem I'm going to read, and I will send in the chat the title of it because I can't tell you the title. I guess it's the huggy face emoji, right? The kind of which is either, as this poem will explore, either kind of very friendly or slightly creepy. So I've started writing very inadvertently a series of poems that takes as their titles various emojis, which I think actually we are in some ways moving towards visual iconographic language again, which is where we came from, and the ubiquity of emojis and texts and all kinds of things, I think maybe subconsciously made me start writing these poems. So this one is the little huggy face emoji. Hey, 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 today's the happy day to cavort and play before we all decay back to clay. Shuck off the Oxford grey, push away the morose divorcee buffet, and instead turn up the reggae to sway under the bouquet of the Milky Way. For you are a pistol in May, and I your bumblebee. Or you my bumblebee with your groping spaz hands, and I someone who wants to enjoy a soda at the picnic table in peace, please. I fear you're not respecting my personal space, King Lear, and I'm gonna gonorrhea out of here to the nearest sanctuary, for you appear a creep. Thankfully, the ambiguity of signs never vanishes, nor the ancient primate instinct to behold and be held. Necessito anombrazo, for gratitude, consolation, and comfort, but not in the Lyndon Johnson way of being held too tight to wiggle. Just do it with love. Ta-da, that's the big reveal. All right, so I'm going to switch, and you might notice I like to work in different forms, and the next couple of poems I'm going to read are all in either existing or invented forms, and maybe I'll just read this very short one, which is a form called an erasure, and some people might know what that is, but it's a poem where essentially I've taken away words, and there's a great erasure poem by Tracy K. Smith called Declaration, where she erases parts of the Declaration of Independence in her poem. And this poem is just an erasure of a poem by Lord Byron, the romantic poet, called Lines Inscribed Upon a Cup Formed from a Skull, right? That begins, start not, nor deem my spirit fled. In me, behold the only skull from which, unlike a living head, whatever flows is never dull. So that was Byron. And so I decided to do an erasure, and because his poem is in perfect rhyming quatrains, mine is in these little haikus, and it's just called Lines on the Skull. Start, spirit, behold the skull, a living head loved earth. My bones resign the worm, lips to hold sparkling grapes slimy circle, shape of reptiles' food. Where wit shone of shine, where our brains are substitute, like me, with the dead, life's little, our head sad, redeemed in wasting clay, this chance, be of use. All right. Just have a couple more here. Thank you all. This is wonderful, and I believe the reading will be archived as well, which is very nice. I'm going to read this poem, and I think afterwards we can maybe take a look at it, because it's kind of a concrete poem, and it's a poem about conjoined twins, Siamese twins, as they're told. And in fact, there is a great poem by Kathy Park Hong about Chang and Ang, the original Siamese twins who were born in what is present-day Thailand in Siam. And I was actually just in the middle of my day turning on the news, and all of a sudden I saw these two little girls who were on the news paraded out, and they were attached and could not be separated, and they were being interviewed. And that's where this comes from. It's called Conjoined. And the little epigraph is, I have come to love you in spite of. Straddling the windowsill, watching morning glimmer, from the terminal, spectral gray becomes blonde as coffee cools. Here near where cheer-ups erupt, whoosh of man, hosing down cleft sidewalks, raising wraiths of spray against loops of barbed wire that gem in early sun. Invisible spokes of caffeine begin to rotate into awareness, porous enough to feel nose hairs filtering breath. It's the closest to the Psalms I come this early, filled still with dawn tuning strings, swooping pigeons, unfastening shutters, one pulse and pure influence until the remote resolves the screen into a voice that fills the room like cologne. Stigmatized for years as circus spectacles, hear what it's really like to be connected to a sibling. Conjoined twins flash on screen, two girls kissing craniums. One faces one way, the other another. Sheen of polished teeth, their specialist doctor grinning beneath a solid state shield mask to address us. The result of a rare embryological accident has made these two sisters literally inseparable. Serenity now stops working, contracts, sharing brain tissue they can't be split, must negotiate where to go, who speaks at what time, how to dress, when to use the bathroom. Only agreeing being out in public torments them. Suddenly, I love them more for that slightly. One, a minute older, suffers from spina bifida, still hopes to become a country singer. The other one wants to be a nurse. Both hope to be mothers. They turn a practiced orbit, each allowing the other equal chance to address the camera, looking directly through at me. I can't imagine life without her, yet every day I try. I think God made us this way because we are special. Then the keyboard synth loop pounds their face to commercial. Blind sunrise, blithely persistent, flickers through the window. I don't even know their names. Try to recall hope, to feel whole. Holy Land, rather on synapses, gray matter, the invisible ubiquitous signals of spectrum, parabola shot and antenna caught every single second. The amount of time it takes 4.2 babies take to be born. All right. And I have, I have one poem I really want to share. I don't know if there'll be time for the last poem. There might be, but this is the poem that I wrote really about belonging. And the theme here, and it's kind of wonderful to hear how all of these poems are constellating and speaking to different ideas of this theme. And so I will just maybe read this poem. So it's a little bit longer, and if there's time, I can read the last one. But it's called Latin for New World Order, and I don't think I need to. I'll just say that it's a poem that mentions Vincent Chin, and I don't know if people know who Vincent Chin was. He was a Chinese American auto worker who in the 1980s was murdered in Detroit by someone who mistook him for Japanese and blamed him for taking his job. And he was beaten to death with a baseball bat. And the two white men who did it, didn't spend a day in prison. They were given probation and a $500 fine. And this act actually was one of the catalysts for connecting communities of Asian populations together and really combine, Indian Americans and Chinese Americans and Vietnamese Americans all kind of started to get coalesce around this event. So that's mentioned in here. So this is called Latin for New World Order. Over a plate of 3-bean salad, a Jamaican friend confesses between bites that he hates people of color. Not us as beings, but the phrase itself, the way it turns each unique polyvalent human monolithic as Stone Mountain in Atlanta, whose north face bas relief depicts Confederate President Jefferson Davis, General Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson, who as a kid, I'll admit I thought was a bona fide badass tactician. The angry pain that image elicits each time he visits the ATL scars him differently than it does me. You don't even know. You ain't black, he says, a cannellini being speared on a raised fork for emphasis, affecting his best ludicrous imitation, which I don't tell him could be in its own form of cultural appropriation, given, as he so often reminds me, that he's from the land of Antillean grackles, callaloo, spidery mangroves, and kicking up the rumpus. Still, I see his point. Lumping together Mashantucket, Pequot, Creek, Navajo, and Choctaw and Lakota people as Native Americans, yoking the granddaughter of an Alabama sharecropper descended from slaves with a Singaporean American banker who flew first class to move into a lower Manhattan brownstone. POC has its problems, true, just as the median economic indicators of Asian Americans ignores the struggle of the Hmong, the Bhutanese, the Cambodian, or the Bangladeshi immigrant communities in cities from sea to shining sea. Thinking of how to respond to my Kingston friend, I suddenly conjure St. Vincent Chin, the Chinese-American draftsman who was celebrating his bachelor party in Highland Park, Michigan in 1982, when he was mistaken for being Japanese by a Chrysler plant supervisor and his stepson, a laid-off auto worker who blamed Toyota, Honda, and Nissan for his own misfortune. Handsome Vincent Chin in suit and glasses, or a gold medallion, that luxurious mane of hair, his whole life ahead of him, beaten to death with a baseball bat by two white men who didn't spend a day in prison. Their second-degree murder charge was pled down to manslaughter, and they were sentenced to pay no more than probation and a $3,000 fine. In a letter, the presiding judge wrote, "These weren't the kind of men that you send to jail." Which begs the question, what kind of men do you send to jail? The case joined Asian Americans around ethnic lines, helping shape multiracial alliances to advocate for civil rights, which is part of my answer to the POC conundrum. I'm a a Tamilian Brahmin American, also a man of color who has been slurred, jailed, mocked, discriminated against. There's strength in solidarity and amplification in knowing those of us with skin darker than a grocery bag, a heritage traced back to conquest and colony, have a community who collectively can speak discontent to privilege with greater force. We must all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately, to crib the famous anti-classicist of kite-flying Benjamin Franklin, who, while inventing bifocal glasses and dreaming up the lightning rod, was also decrying low women, labeling Native Americans as drunken savages who delight in war and take pride in murder, and describing African Americans as sullen, malicious, revengeful, and by their very nature thieves. He also owned slaves while later serving as president of an abolitionist society hard to find an acronym for, the Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery and the Relief of Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage. While less than 3 months before he died, he petitioned Congress to provide the means to bring slavery to an end. Deep within the American character, there fester such raw, scabrous, unresolved contradiction. On the U.S. seal Franklin designed and placed beneath the disembodied eye crowning the pyramid on the dollar bill, there's a Latin phrase, Novus Ordo Secularum, or a new order of the ages. Though Franklin preferred the motto, rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. What should Vincent Chin's family make of that advice? How about Srinivas Kuchibhotla, the affable Indian American engineer from Hyderabad, shot dead in Olathe, Kansas by a bar patron who mistook him for Iranian, shouting, "Get out of my country, terrorists," and "Are you legal?" before murdering him in cold blood? He could have so easily been me, even if I was born Similac-free in Washington, D.C. on the Sunday the Pittsburgh Steelers won the Super Bowl. That's why Black Lives Matter. That's why human rights. That's why I rock the POC, even grown sick and wary that it's maddeningly PC, imprecise, overgeneralizes and essentializes. I make my claim. My buddy flashes a wry smile, finishes his salad, and bikes off into the corncob robed afternoon. A new order of the ages, the countervailing powers balancing a capitalist democracy, which means it's not just an ethical, but a civic and patriotic duty to fight inequity and uproot racism in whatever form we find. And if anyone ever tells you differently, just refer them to the back of a dollar bill. Thank you. And I have one more, but I think I'm probably at my time, so I'll stop there. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Ravi. I think your poems were amazing, and I think it's lovely how, you know, you've covered so many different topics that are just, you know, not only relevant within our community, but beyond that, you know, whether it be through referencing human rights or the Black Lives Matter movement, etc. So the first question that Shrishti and I had for you is about your emoji poem. And just to let you know, Shrishti and I went back and forth about this for a while before, you know, finally mustering the courage to ask you. So we noticed that this poem follows a structure that's really similar to the theme song of The Land Before Time, which also starts with "Hey, hey, hey, today is the happy day."
Whoa, that is totally like a subconscious thing.
Yeah, you even mentioned like when until you turn into dust. I was like, this is definitely about Land Before Time.
Well, I did think I watched it in my youth, but I don't remember it at all. And now I'm going to have to like Google it. Maybe it was subconsciously seated in my memory somehow. How funny.
Yeah, we were just so like we weren't sure if it was a reference or, you know, whether it was something that we weren't supposed to pick up on. It was interesting. So yeah, I'm glad we got to the bottom of it.
It was quick.
Yeah. So we want to go back to your poem Conjoined, and it has a very interesting structure. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so everyone can have a chance to take a look at it. All right. Apologies for the delay. Here it is. So we were kind of curious about, you know, the structure that you have in Conjoined, you know, where you've very physically shown what you're trying to say about these two sisters. And although you say that the sisters are, as your title says, joined together, we see a lot of schisms that are physically there in your poem where the words are forced apart. And so we were curious and wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, and this is a poem, and I think actually the lineation is a little off. It really is meant to be in two columns, and it has those interspersed moments of external dialogue, which serve a couple of functions, I think. One, it's the voices from the television screen, but secondly, it is a kind of literal embodiment of this physical connection that these two girls shared. And what I was experimenting with, and I can't take credit for it, but it's a great kind of form of poetry that I first saw in Tyehimba Jess, Pulitzer Prize winning poet who wrote this book, Lead Belly. And he has these poems which you can read both vertically and horizontally. And so that was what I was kind of trying to work with here. And I think in some ways you can kind of read it either across or down. But I was trying, I think, to really get at that idea that that there are these two separate bodies who are both united as one. And what it really means, I mean, to our conception of the divine, that this happens, right? It was just really heartbreaking to see these girls with all of these ambitions and feel like they were being forced to perform for an audience on television. And so it was all of these complicated emotions. And I think that shape-wise, I was really trying to get at that idea of the way in which they were connected.
That's a beautiful idea. And I just wanted to add kind of as a comment that I really like the epigraph that you had for Conjoined. I have come to love you in spite of. I love the fact that you chose it because I think it just fits so perfectly with your poem and the ideas you're trying to convey.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it kind of matches with, you know, our theme of immigration and being in a foreign land, of loving things in spite of at times, because you're always combating so many different structures. So I absolutely love the poem The Suspicious Bulge, and also the Latin for New World Order. I mean, those two kind of go hand in hand, especially with the shooting of Jacob Blake. And I'm very, very happy that you actually ended up sharing these two poems, because they're quite relevant. And then they also bridge, you know, that connection between us being people of color, even when people try to deny that sometimes from us. And I think that's a very nuanced topic these days. So actually, I wanted you to elaborate a little bit on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's just one of these things that I think I feel conflicted about. Just as when I went to graduate school in New York, and I was in a creative writing program as one of two. There was another Kashmir American, Rafi Kathwari, who was my classmate, but we were the only two people there. And so this idea of being Indian American, even in some ways, I felt like it helps provide a community. In other ways, it felt like it was delimiting, at least for my classmates, what I could potentially write about. And that whenever there was some mention of yoga or elephants, they would all turn to me as the kind of in-house expert. And I somehow also internalized it and felt like, well, I should know more about the Vedas than these other people who I'm sitting around with. So I do appreciate, I mean, I think when you introduced me, you mentioned that I have this fellowship at the University of Sydney. And there in Australia, I think it's really beautiful that all the public events are opened with this welcome to nation and acknowledgement of the original stewards of the land who are called by name. And even though some of my Australian friends think it's a little toothless, I was always really deeply moved and touched, and imagining what it would be like if in the US we did something similar, acknowledge the slaves on whose backs the wealth of the nation was built, or the Native American tribes who were displaced. And so it really is very complicated. I mean, my friend from Jamaica basically was trying to say, well, you guys, you're Indian Americans, you're wealthier than Caucasian Americans per capita. And so to call yourself POC is like, you know, you can't take on. But the other side of it is that collectively we do face discrimination, and Asian Americans are not a monolithic entity. All of our groups are different. And if we can kind of join together to speak truth to power, I think we have a stronger voice. So I was trying to explore all of those sides, and I'm not sure if I've made up my mind exactly how I feel. How do other people feel about that term? Use it?
I definitely think that our generation uses the term POC.
Yeah.
Well, there's BIPOC now, which is like Black and Indigenous people of color, which kind of distinguishes that minority group that's more marginalized. That said, it also kind of leaves out the Latin population. So I'm not sure how I feel about that term, but I agree that as a woman of color, I have faced a lot of oppression in different spaces, whether that was academic science or, you know, just having my voice heard in a space of mostly white people. And I've lived in places that is not the Silicon Valley and Bay Area. So this place is, of course, heavily South Asian. But if you go anywhere else in the country, which I'm sure a lot of you are from different parts of the country, it's not as, you know, it's not this like homogenous brown space. It's very different, and people don't take what you say seriously. And like you said, you end up being the all-knowing, you know, Indian Hindu philosopher type, which I'm like, that might not be me, but I do resonate with other portions of my identity. So I'm very happy that you included that. Also, you had Vincent Chin, which was really beautiful too, because Asian Americans, AAPI communities right now are facing so much discrimination due to the pandemic, and rates of racism against them has risen. So I was really happy that that was also, included. Kanchan, do you want to ask one last question?
Sure. This is actually something that I actually want to open up to all the poets here, and that is, I'm a young poet of color, and I think I speak for other young poets of color when, trying to find your voice and trying to show what your identity truly is on paper is excruciatingly difficult. And so I was wondering if I could ask you all for a little bit of advice that you might have for up and coming poets who are trying to understand how to write.
Anyone can answer.
I can just start and we can go on. I mean, you probably know about the Asian American Writers Workshop and Kundiman, these organizations. I think finding community, I always found having a writing group was so helpful and useful. I also think, are you interested in getting an MFA or going to a writing program?
I don't know yet, but I think creative writing is very high on my list of things that I want to pursue after high school.
Yeah. Well, I think that's something to keep in mind. I would actually encourage you after to maybe think about a PhD program, or there are a lot of different possibilities, but I think an organization like Matwaala, for example, you should definitely be a member of, and Pramila and Usha try to do events and organize things around the country. So I think that is one way to get out there and find people that you resonate with. I mean, other people, I'm sure there's a lot of good advice. Ralph?
You have to unmute yourself.
I think Ravi has said a lot about the politics of color, and it's this centrality in contemporary U.S. life. It's deeply ingrained, and it's expressing itself in various ways, blatant and subtle. And some communities are hurt much more than others, obviously. So, Kanchan, when you asked that question about a young poet of color wanting to sort of wanting to make headway, as I said, the politics of this is going to be addressed on a daily basis, and it's going to be informing your creativity, the content matter, your sensibility, and all of that, right? But I'd like to sort of push you, as I try to push myself as being a colored person, is to, and believe me, I don't shy away from the politics at all, because I've been in the classroom for 40 years. And it was my main agenda to bring home to my students the issue of what it means to be residents of the sole superpower, and a racist one at that. Okay, so the politics was all out there. But what I'm noticing now at my age, and I would think sort of hearing this point of view might be useful for you, is to ask the question, is it possible to, not necessarily to transcend this, but is it possible to get to a point where you will be able to explore something about yourself that somehow, not magically, but seriously eludes these difficulties? Who are you? How do you belong? Does belonging or being at home or in exile have to be framed merely as a political issue? Or is there some sort of an existential angle to this, where you might go really deep into who you are and use that as a place of strength, which will possibly or hopefully enable you to deal with the slings and arrows of color consciousness? See what I'm saying?
Right.
So now the problem with this is that somebody else might say, hey, Ralph, you're sort of moving this out of context, because we human beings are always in context. So I'm sort of putting before you an interesting philosophical issue. Like, we are political creatures. We are always in context. But is there some place where we sort of slip through into another dimension? And would it be extraordinary for you to explore that in the face of this? Definitely, it is not an evasion. This is not a form of trying to say, well, I live on another plane. Far from it, far from it. But in fact, to get to that place from where, a location from where your engagement with the politics of the day might become even more penetrating, see, and more meaningful in some ways. That's a long answer, sorry, but I had to sort of get into the, I'm not exactly clear about whether the feasibility of this, but I sense the need not to be constantly trapped into the sociopolitics of identity.
I'm going to let someone else answer, but can I just give a quick shout for you to maybe translate Konkani? And, when you talked about the loss of that language, maybe there's some way in which you reclaim it. Because I know some wonderful Goan poets who have not ever been translated into English, and that might be a way to kind of interface with your own mother tongue and the culture and do something really rewarding for all of us, because that would be great.
I think that's a wonderful idea. These past couple weeks in quarantine, I've actually had some time to, go back and revisit my Konkan roots and, get a little bit better at the language that I've been losing my grasp on. So I think that would be wonderful. I think that's definitely something I'll try out. Thank you both, Ravi and Ralph. I think both of your pieces of advice were so valuable for me, and I'm really glad that I'll be leaving this reading with not only just everyone's poetry, but also your words of wisdom.
Kanchan, may I just piggyback briefly on what Ravi said just now?
Sure.
I mean, I gave
actually, Ralph, I'm so sorry. We're actually super over time, but yes. I wanted to ask one question from the public before we end. So if you don't mind, we'll save the advice for later, maybe towards the end, and you can tell her.
Absolutely.
So the question that we got was from Frederick Spears, and his question is for the entire panel. So I would like everybody to answer the question if possible. His question is, can you tell us a little bit about how otherness and voice figures into your poems? For example, how do you embody another's voice? And which voices might have been proven to be more difficult for you to incorporate into your poems, and why? Kieran, maybe if you could start.
A great question and a hard one. I think, incorporating other voices invariably leads us into all kinds of really interesting philosophical questions that are connected to identity, which we've already been talking about. There's no doubt that one of the most complicated questions, I think, in literary culture right now is who gets to speak from which perspectives and which voices. And certainly, I think we all face that in different ways in our poems. For me, particularly, it's sometimes been speaking in the voice of somebody who is no longer here to speak for themselves. And to what degree do I have authority to do that? And what are my obligations when I do that? And I've kind of confronted it by making both the other and myself both present in some way in the poem so that my perspective is clear. And that voice, though imagined, is somehow in contrast and illuminating my very limited perspective. And that sense of placing, the speaker between the imagined self and the reader, I think, is one way in which we can acknowledge both our desire to incorporate otherness and also our limitations, our context, as Ralph was just saying, which, depending on what kinds of voices we're interacting, what kinds of otherness we're interacting with, I think can be incredibly important.
Gita, if you would like to answer the question.
Actually, I echo what Kiran has said. Even all my poems, it always comes with that. It stems from different conversations, or sometimes it's an imagined conversation, but mostly it's these different perspectives as we see others, and with the limited experience as myself being an economic migrant who did not go through many of the horrors that everybody else or others have gone through with whom I am in touch. So it's always these conversations and these perspectives that make my poem, I think, more vibrant. As also, it is this notion like um, how much I'm stuck here with words. What kind of privilege you can provide and how privileged you are to do that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Gita. Ralph, would you like to answer the question?
Yeah, I think that both Gita and Kiran covered a lot there, and the complexity of speaking from another point of view. One obvious trap and danger is appropriation, right? We all have to be extremely careful about, for whom are we speaking and what right do we have, and how sensitive, how much do we have to empty ourselves to be able to do it with authenticity, right? That's one thing. So let me go off to a completely different point very quickly, is I try to open myself up to some voices I believe have been suppressed within me, and that is the voice of the woman. And I have poems in which a woman speaks through me, and she is often a composite of all the grandmothers and the aunts and the mothers and so on. And the voice that comes out carries a kind of sedimented wisdom or point of view that I could never have summoned up on my own. So in other words, it is a form of stepping aside or emptying my room so that these other people can come and inhabit it, at least momentarily, as long as they don't completely invade and take over, which is which is sometimes a problem. But yeah, so that is another thing, is beyond appropriation as to how to open myself up to another voice and give it some room to move around in. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ralph. That was a very insightful answer. Ravi, would you like to piggyback off of what they've said?
Yeah, I will just add. I mean, I think that this is again very a complicated issue. But there's a Pakistani woman novelist, Kamila Shamsi, who has written that because there's so many people, Roxanne Gay among them, that say stay in your own lane. You shouldn't really take on the voice of another ethnicity. And what she has written, I think, really stimulatingly, is that if you're saying that, like, no other novelist can take on the voice of a Pakistani woman, what you're essentially saying is that they're inscrutable and too mysterious, and you're perpetuating a certain stereotype that prevents dialogue from actually happening. And so how can we respectfully engage with one another while not using or appropriating, I think, is an important question. And certainly one I struggled with in that long poem I read. My friend is Jamaican and I can't really capture his voice, but I was trying a little bit to get some of his inflections in there. But it's very dangerous territory, right? If you're writing in dialect, there's a chance that you're being reductive. But I feel like the answer is not tiptoeing around the difficult issues surrounding race, but actually, trying something and asking people, does this succeed? Does this not succeed? What am I missing? And actually trying to engage with the discomfort rather than pushing it aside, which is what I think has happened for so long. And we're seeing that the ultimate results are not very healthy. So.
Thank you, Ravi. That is true. Appropriation is a very touchy subject. So it's hard to know. I've read that by Roxanne Gay, so I have my own thoughts on that. But it's good to hear all the different perspectives. Kanchan, if you have any closing remarks, you want to answer the question, then everybody, if you have any closing remarks, you're welcome to say them.
And can you tell us where can anyone subscribe to India Currents and follow it online?
Absolutely.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. Anyone can go on indiacurrents.com, subscribe. It's free, which is awesome. If you'd like to donate, that's great because we are a community journal and I only get paid if I get some donations. So all of us are relying heavily on donations. So if you like this event, please donate to Matwaala and India Currents.
And can all my friends who have failed completely to hear this reading because they're all technophobes, can they access it at some point?
Correct. It'll be on Facebook in our archives. It'll be on the BigStage platform as an archive, and it will probably be as an article on our website. So there will be multiple ways for you to get access to this reading.
Okay. Thank you.
No problem.
Right. I think that, as for the question, Shrishti, that you posed, I'd say that personally how I feel about it has definitely been covered by everyone else here. I do just want to echo a point that was brought up by both Ralph and Ravi about the dangers of appropriation. I think that that's a fear of mine that I come face to face with pretty much on a daily basis when I'm trying to write, especially because I think it's so difficult to separate your own voice from your experience. And I think that does often bring us dangerously close to what perhaps might be appropriation or the silencing of other unique voices that deserve to be heard. I think that with honesty, and I think definitely with patience, both with myself and hopefully others around me who can correct me on this, I think growing from that fear comes hopefully with time.
Thank you, everybody. Don't leave quite yet. I just want to say some thanks before everyone gets off this call. I want to thank all of our poets, Ralph, Gita, Kiran, Ravi, and Kanchan, for giving voice to the identity crisis in a new space in a foreign land. Whichever South Asian diaspora we're from, we can find unity in experiences as people of color, as we've found through the poetry we've heard today. And I want to talk a little bit about the fact that the theme of this was belonging in America, but also about the Census 2020, because we want our narratives and our voices to be heard. And the census only comes once every 10 years. So I want you to make sure that to ensure that your voices are heard for the next 10 years, that you do take the Census 2020. There is no citizenship question, in case you were wondering. Lastly, or not lastly, but I want to thank Kanchan, my co-moderator and my young partner in crime, who never ceases to amaze me in how much she can do. How unique and refreshing to be reminded that you can find support in the younger generation. Even though I might look young, I'm still much older than Kanchan, and I find her as a solid pillar in my life for India Currents and in general to talk about, the things that I face as a woman of color in this world. So thank you, Kanchan, so much for doing such a great job moderating, but also for your poetry, which enlightens all of us, I'm sure.
Thank you.
Thank you to Deepak from BigStage, who helped me develop this whole online platform that you're now seeing all of the poetry on. Deepak has taken an endless stream of questions from me, so I could not be more grateful to Deepak for creating this free online platform for nonprofits. Thank you so much, Deepak. He is part of Democracy Labs and also BigStage Online. I want to thank the IC team, including our publisher, Vandana Kumar, who has given us a platform to do this poetry reading and listens to my ideas and allows me to follow through. So thank you so much. And I want to thank Matwaala. Pramila and Usha have been mentioned a few times, the directors of Matwaala, who have brought these poets together in unison to talk about this very important theme in America. So thank you, Pramila and Usha, for providing us these wonderful, articulate poets who can speak to our narratives. So if you have enjoyed this event, please consider donating to Matwaala and India Currents. There are links on our websites. And thank you all for sitting and listening. I appreciate you all. And I hope to see you again at our next poetry reading, the last in the series with Matwaala. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye. Bye.